All right, welcome back, everyone. And before we begin our next session, I'm just curious, what is something that you learned from that previous session that you hope to apply to your role? Because I see there's a lot of great feedback that came through the chat. I'm just curious, like, what's something that you hope to apply to your role, either as an SSO or in your RTA related to your relationships? I'm curious. Let's see some things happen in that chat. All right, so we're gonna meet with the board in person. Okay, in person. I have some guesses on why you specifically said that, but I would ask, why in person? Why would you use that language? Okay, Frank says CTA joins. Leroy, continue building the trust and transparency. Transparency is a very powerful word. RTA and SSO working well together is important. Pam says it reinforced that our communication with the RTA is solid. That's awesome. That's really, really good. What's some other things that you hope to apply? All right, David says basic communication is apparently a problem. Okay, and then there are some steps that you all can apply to addressing the communication, collaboration, absolutely. So that set the stage for really, my opinion, is these are some things that you can apply through any situation across the board. Let's see. Validate the needs to ensure requirements are established, communicated routinely. All right, communication. So take with that and do what you will. So now let's move into our next session. So the next session will cover state safety oversight agencies oversight to ensure that rail transit agencies include a description of the safety certification process and other information to ensure safety concerns and hazards are addressed prior to major capital projects. So please join me with the loudest applause possible in welcoming Ruth Lyons, Senior Program Manager in FTA's Office of Safety Review, Daren Gilbert, Manager of the Rail Transit and Crossing Branch, California Public Utilities Commission, and SSO Manager Eric Stoegbauer from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. With that, Ruth, over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. Next slide, please. Stand by 1 second. I'm having a difficulty here. Next slide, please. Sorry. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Ramsey, for that introduction. So what I'd like to do is discuss here the overview, what we're going to be discussing in this presentation. This presentation will focus on state safety oversight agencies' responsibilities to oversee rail transit agency capital projects. So as listed here on the slide, we'll be discussing the following areas: authority for oversight, guidance provided, minimum requirements, state safety oversight activities in the oversight of capital projects, rail transit agency project plans, FTA resources, and new starts. Next slide, please. In addition to state safety oversight agencies' requirement to oversee rail-fixed skyway public transportation systems, or what we often refer to as rail transit agencies, federal law requires SSOAs to oversee rail transit agencies that are in engineering and construction. As with a state safety oversight of a rail transit agency in operation, an SSOA must also oversee projects in the engineering and construction phase, or capital projects. The SSOA must ensure safety requirements during the capital project phase are met. This is based on minimum requirements of the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan before the project is allowed to enter into revenue service. Now, capital projects or oversight of engineering and construction minimum requirements require that RTA's PTASK must include how an SSOA will oversee the process. This must also be provided in the State Safety Oversight Agency's program standard. Next slide, please. 49 CFR 673 specifically describes how an RTA should address capital projects, and this is through its safety risk management process. We will discuss this a little further on the next slide. Next slide, please. Safety risk management is further outlined in 49 CFR 25A, and it states a transit agency must develop and implement a safety risk managed process for all elements of its public transportation system. Now, in this case, the element we're discussing is capital projects, or during the engineering and construction phase. Next slide. The capital project has many aspects of oversight, but the one constant is the SSOA's review during the engineering and construction phase. If a project is funded by federal funds and meets a certain threshold, then a project management oversight contractor, or PMOC, will be assigned. The PMOC will review project risks related to the project scope, cost estimate, and schedule. So if the project is not funded with federal funds, the transit agency must still have a project plan. And for all capital project oversight activities, the FTA Office of Transit Safety and Oversight will monitor the SSOA's activities to ensure it carries out its responsibilities as outlined in the program standard for the SSOA. Now let's discuss a few activities. The state safety oversight activities for capital projects may include ensuring a program standard addresses engineering and construction oversight processes. You need to ensure that the program standard states the authority for the SSOA to carry out oversight of capital projects and the process or procedures it will use to carry out its responsibilities. Another activity is to ensure program standard that you identify the minimum PTASK requirements. To avoid confusion, the SSOA program standard must outline minimum requirements and RTAs in their RTA's PTASK. The PTASK must also include the minimum requirements as it relates to the capital projects. Now, also the review and approval of the PTASK. The State Safety Oversight Agency must review an RTA's PTASK to ensure that it includes the minimum requirements of capital projects. Once the SSOA is satisfied the requirements are met, it is at that time that the PTASK can be approved. Next, conducting oversight activities for the capital projects. This phase is often referred to as the pre-revenue service review of a capital project. This should at a minimum cover the alignment, facilities, and equipment. Determination on pre-revenue service review should be based on the RTA's PTASK and the project plan for scope and schedule. If there is a PMOC assigned, the SSOA should not duplicate efforts, but rather leverage those efforts to address program standard and PTASK requirements. If there is no PMOC, the SSOA should rely on its program standard and PTASK requirements. Next slide, please. So an RTA project plan should include the following elements as listed here. Again, remember, these items cover projects that are federally funded. However, the RTA must still have a plan for all capital projects regardless of its funding. The SSOA must oversee the safety elements of an RTA's project plan and PTASK as outlined in the SSOA program standard. Next slide, please. As previously stated, these items cover projects that are federally funded, and an RTA must still have a plan for all capital projects, regardless of its funding. Provided here are FTA resources that are available on our website, and if you have any questions on how to access them, you can reach out to us. Next slide, please. Regarding new service, once an RTA has met all established requirements or pre-revenue service requirements, the SSOA will authorize or sign off for the project to go into revenue service. This process has been referred to by many different names, such as certification of projects or approval of projects, etc. Whatever your state may call it, the bottom line is that a project must meet the established safety requirements outlined before revenue service begins. Next slide, please. I want to thank you for your time with this presentation. And now I'd like to kick it on over to Daren Gilbert with the CPUC. Daren.
Okay, there you go. I'm sorry. Good morning. Thank you, Ruth. Great job. So I am Daren Gilbert. I think most of you know me. I manage the Rail Transit Safety Branch at the California Public Utilities Commission. And I have been in that position since 2010, and I managed crossings before that. So let's go ahead and get into the presentation. Next slide, please. So this safety certification process in California follows along with the federal guidelines, and so it has three major components. The first part is, what you do beforehand. That's review and approval of the safety certification plan. And then the second stage of safety certification is, once that is approved and in the can, the project begins, and you need to participate in all the activities that you can in order to assure that you're conducting the activities required by your program standard and the agency's PTASP. So, and then, as the project nears completion, you'll be provided the testing and schedule of construction. So, our involvement is pretty significant throughout that portion of the project. And then, of course, at the end of the project, they have to submit a safety certification verification report. And that initiates, a final rush to make sure you've reviewed and approved all the documents and that the concerns that you've identified throughout the project have been addressed. And ultimately resulting in an approval, as Ruth mentioned, for them to go into revenue service. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have a lot of projects going on in California. The ones in red are active current projects in construction, or at least the project is moving in one way or another. So a bunch of major projects, there's probably $15 billion worth of capital projects in this list. Some of them are on the cusp of going into service. Some are just getting started. So as you can see, we have a lot of experience with safety certification in California. Next slide, please. So in California, we do have Commission General Order 164, and it contains the programmatic requirements for the RTAs in California. So it, requires that the safety certification occur, and it also has a bunch of definitions. So major projects is defined in section 2.17. So we don't use a dollar amount in California. A major project is evaluated based on the effect it has on the system. Is it new and different technology? If it's a standard line extension, those require safety certification. So our advice to our RTAs is that when the project is in its infancy, we should get together and discuss its scope and determine whether formal safety certification is necessary. Next slide, please. So then our General Order 164, Section 11 requires the submission and development of a safety certification plan. And then that section also requires that it be submitted for review and commission approval. So that's a good process. Everybody understands the requirements here in California. And once the safety certification plan is approved, and if we're in agreement, we bring that before the commission in a resolution and they give a formal approval to that. Once that is done, revisions and updates to the plan can be approved at staff level. Next slide, please. So at the end of the project, Section 12 of our general order requires the submission of a safety certification verification report in compliance with the federal guidelines. So the requirement in California is that they submit it 21 days before revenue service is scheduled to begin, and staff must respond within 14 days to let them know whether any concerns have been identified. So next slide, please. So how we, as a practical matter, how we implement these is, you can go ahead and change to the next slide, please. Is that we've outlined in our program standard, and of course our general orders specify the requirements. So the program standards gives detail and structure for both the RTAs and my staff. So our program standards is distributed to our RTAs for review and comment prior to its implementation, or its, implementing any revisions. And so they should all be aware of any requirements that are contained therein. Our checklist that we use to review and approve safety certification plans is included within our program standard as an appendix. And in California, we also have and make use of a safety and security certification oversight plan. So that's a document that we provide to the RTA at the beginning of a project that telegraphs to them what we're, at the beginning of the project at least, what we're interested in seeing, what we're interested in observing, and what our expectations are. So that's a document that could be revised throughout the project, or, at the middle of the project if things change from beginning to end. And it basically says to them, this is what we definitely want to know about. Now, we've all had many projects with most of our RTAs, and so we're aware of generally whatever is going on. And we may decide when we get the testing schedule that there are other tests that we didn't identify in our safety, our SSCOP, that we want to observe. And so that is certainly, we're able to do that with our RTAs and work out generally what we are interested in seeing and scheduling that field work to be there. And our program standard also advises on recommended activities and general expectations. So that's what I just basically mentioned. There's a good free flow of communication. And again, we're attending all the safety certification and fire life safety committee meetings, and we can make our requests known at those times. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our safety certification oversight plan indicates to the RTAs our expectations and what we're going to want to see as part of the project. Here are some examples of the things that we would require notification and want to attend and let our RTAs know that. So And some of it is testing of actual physical infrastructure, and some of it is attending, you know, like for emergency response drills and those sorts of things, you know, their interaction and preparation for service outside the actual construction. Next slide, please. So some of the key elements, in our view, for successful safety certification of a project, is that our guidelines and our program standard follow the FTA guidelines that were issued in 2002. This is nothing new for all of our agencies. The expectations and the background give us sufficient information, both our side and the RTA side, that everyone knows what's going on and what's required. So we feel like early engagement is really important. So we get involved in the environmental stage. When the notice of preparation comes out for our project, we file an official comment letter outlining our jurisdiction, although a lot of the projects are, you know, offered by agencies that are under our current jurisdiction, and they are aware of those, so that it becomes part of the public record. We file those comments. So we also have a couple of new operators. Orange County Streetcar is a completely new operator. Orange County has not run a transit system before, so we met with them when it was the Santa Ana Garden Grove streetcar, and so that was about 9 years ago. And so we get involved early with folks you know, as early as we can. So again, we attend all the project meetings, the safety and certification review, fire life safety, design review. And in California, we do have approval authority over rail crossings. Our rail crossings group handles that. We work closely with them when they are discussing with the project proponents the railroad crossings. And then I also encourage you to, if there are FTA quarterly meetings, you should attend those and participate and become a person on the agenda to speak, and let the attendees, the FTA, the project people, if there's a PMOC, everyone who's involved, know what's going on safety-wise. And I can't tell you that this has been invaluable. So when we're having an issue or a problem or a concern, we can bring it up at the FTA meeting, and I don't know, for some reason, the people with the money get a lot of attention. And you can resolve some problems that way. So your FTA regional administrator and the FTA folks in your region, you know, can add significant issues to the risk registry, and that can motivate resolution of issues that seem to be sometimes stuck. So next slide, please. As I just mentioned, take active engagement at the meetings. You know, if there are safety concerns or something doesn't sound quite right, you know, mix it up and get in there and get involved. It can sometimes help the RTAs and the contractors over some rough spots. You know, as we all know, most projects end up with the contractor suing the RTA at the end of the project, right? So if you can help resolve some of those issues, that is so much better than allowing the relationship to degrade. Our inspectors and our site visits are invaluable. So I recommend that if you can, get your folks out there. I think I've mentioned to the SSOAs in the past, a lot of you have groups that are involved in the FRA state participation program. So if you don't have your own inspectors, you maybe can borrow some from your FRA state participation program inspectors. So I recommend you research that if you don't have that asset. And as safety certification and the project construction continues, the safety certification plan may need to be revised. So we can do that, as I mentioned earlier. So next slide, please. So as I noted, one of my slides was missing, and that was, I don't know what happened to it. It's a slide regarding challenges. So I just wanted to run through a couple of them quickly. Determining when preliminary engineering is getting murkier and murkier. And so the way they do projects now with design, build, design, bid, build, and whatever other order you want to put those in, it can sometimes be a challenge to determine exactly when preliminary engineering starts and ends. So that's a bit of a challenge. We also we're looking at probably updating our safety certification checklists. Although we are using the 2002 guidelines and our established processes, given the 672, 3, and 4 adoption, there are probably changes that are warranted. And so like RTA's, PUC is going through its processes and procedures to determine where we may need to make revisions. And coordinating testing near the end of the project is sometimes a challenge. We don't want to impede the progress of the project, and yet there are certain things we want to see that can sometimes be a challenge. And Ruth mentioned the PMOC. So if there's a PMOC on your project, I recommend that you strike up a relationship with them. The roles are different, but they are a great asset and resource. And a lot of the issues of concern are shared interests. So, and that's the end of my presentation. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Eric Stoegbauer from the great state of Wisconsin that will talk further on this.
Thank you very much, Daren. Appreciate it. And now for something completely different, we're going to go from California, large state with a large program, large and complex projects, to a smaller state safety oversight program with smaller RTAs, and see what's going on there. So next slide, please. So I want to start with part of the preamble to Part 674. It's going to come up later and sort of echoes some of the stuff in Ruth's presentation. So one of the many benefits of SMS is that it is flexible, does not impose a one-size-fits-all methodology. Rather, SMS can be tailored to the mode, size, and complexity of any transit agency in any operating environment. Simply put, SMS requires a transit agency to identify its own safety risks and to target its human and financial resources to manage the potential consequences of those risks. Now, there may not be a quiz later, but hold on to that because it's going to come back. Next slide, please. So what I would like to talk about this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are sort of three general areas. Touch briefly on federal requirements for capital projects oversight, RTA responsibilities, and then competencies specifically of the SSO agency. Next slide, please. So first, just sort of a refresher on what the federal requirements are and where they're located. Federal law, USC 5329E specifically, and then echoed in regulation at CFR Part 674. So financial and legal independence from RTAs, not providing transportation services in the area, not employing RTA administrative employees on the SSO side of things. Those are fairly straightforward. Next slide, please. Then we get into sort of the meat and potatoes, as it were, of the federal requirements. So what an SSO agency is supposed to do: review, approve, oversee, and enforce an RTA's PTASP or ASP the PTASP rule, the ASP document. Investigate, audit the system against the ASP, and then provide an annual status report. So those are some echoing points that were made in earlier presentations. Next slide, please. So now we get to the RTA responsibilities. And I'm just noticing now that those are streetcars from the 2 Wisconsin streetcar agencies. I hope nobody's alarmed at my stellar Photoshop skills. I assure you they're many miles apart and not about to run into one another. But I suppose that's a good slide for another presentation. So the ASP, PTASP rule, 49 CFR part 673, more or less a compendium of requirements for a system safety program. And the idea behind the PTASP is following the federal SMS framework for safety risk identification, analysis, mitigation, and communication of those risks. That's a primary responsibility of an RTA and something that they partner with the SSO in managing. Next slide, please. Now we come back to that pesky little quote from the beginning. SMS requires a transit agency to identify its own safety risks. So it's a primary responsibility of a rail transit agency. One, obviously, the RTA should not take lightly, but one that an SSO agency, in our view, should, sort of tread lightly around. Next slide, please. So given that it's the RTA's responsibility to assess its own risks, for capital projects specifically, there are some things sort of inherently wrapped up in that. So the development of design, construction, and safety testing criteria, and a procedures and plan. And there's no need necessarily to reinvent the wheel on this. This has existed in some capacity, especially at the federal level for some time. So reviewing the federal capital project rules and requirements is a fantastic place to start. But from our perspective, again, at the smaller agency level, the larger piece of what our program standard communicates to our RTAs is to communicate what you are going to do for the capital project, who is going to do it, when they're going to do it, and probably most importantly, what project completion and plan compliance is supposed to look like. Again, this ties into the RTA's responsibility to assess its own risks and put forward a plan that is communicated and followable. Next slide, please. So now we get to the SSO agency competencies concerning capital project oversight. And so as we saw before, a lot of SSO agency requirements are focused on an RTA's ASP, specifically reviewing, approving, overseeing, and enforcing it. Next slide, please. So that said, where we get to the melding of those requirements, the PTASP, and what an SSO agency is competent to do in terms of an RTA's capital project, we call, and I think Ruth had mentioned this in her presentation, a pre-revenue service review, or PRSR. And as the graphic shows, it's meant to be a plan that sort of is communicative and collaborative in the sense that the SSO agency should understand completely what it is that the RTA is setting out to do so that they can oversee their compliance to their own plan. Next slide, please. And so what we do, throwing around some more terminology for everybody, is we shy away specifically from reference to certification or approval. In our view, certification is a term of art, is a specific term, and it means something specific that, again, in our view, is outside an SSO agency's competency. So we follow the concurrence model, where what we would do is review an RTA's safety plan for its capital project, oversee its compliance with that capital project safety plan, and then provide concurrence, assuming a good review, with the RTA's self-certification of their readiness to operate. And that's an important distinction that we see, that it's the RTA who is certifying itself as complete to the process it's identified, in line with its responsibilities under an SMS system of assessing its own risks. Next slide, please. So again, not reinventing the wheel on a lot of this, because the federal capital project review process exists and has definable, intelligible processes and procedures and requirements that have been around for some time. That's a good place to start, which is where we started when looking at our process. And so this sort of mirrors, with a lot less specificity than what Daren said, but mirrors sort of, I think, California's approach. And I want to sort of jump on to what Daren said. Early engagement and open and clear and honest communication is sort of critical to all of this. But in our PRSR process, we would be reviewing the RTA's project and construction management plans that it's developed for a new project, extension project, whatever it might be. And then attend regular RTA project meetings during all the different phases: design, engineering, construction, safety testing, pre-revenue phases. All the phases is just a simpler way to put that. And then reviewing the RTA's SCVR or equivalent, whatever it is that they're going to call it. The SSCVR or SCVR is usually indicative of part of the federal process. But again, it's pretty standard. So next slide, please. All right. Then the sort of end game of this process is to provide concurrence with the RTA's self-certification for readiness to operate. And so again, an RTA is responsible to assess its own project risks. That said, the SSO agency and the RTA, in an ideal situation, are going to communicate and work together to understand and manage those risks throughout the process. Next slide, please. All right, so to wrap up and hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions, in our view, especially for, again, a smaller state agency and smaller, less complex compared to larger systems, RTAs with far fewer extension projects and density of projects. We do not certify RTA capital projects. We do think that's an important distinction to make. That would be outside of our agency competency. The RTA develops its capital project plan, and the SSO agency reviews, approves, oversees, and enforces the PTAS. During the PRSR process, it would be overseeing the RTA's adherence to its identified capital project safety plan. And so at the end of that, the SSO agency concurs with the RTA's self-certification in a pre-revenue service report, and that would be, the successful conclusion of the process. Next slide, please. It's just my contact information for anyone who has specific questions for me, or to rave about my performance here, or tell me where to stick it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Daren, for the presentations. And now Maisha Stephanie is going to assist us with identifying any questions that we received from participants.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. The first question we have is there federal funding for SSOs to provide technical safety oversight that might need to be done under contract with expert consultants?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Maisha. Yes, definitely. 5329 funding will support any activities that are eligible under the use of 5329 funds, and supporting the activities of your program standard to support what you have identified for overseeing capital projects. That will include subject matter expertise. So yes, use of 5329 funding, that would be an eligible expense.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. The next question is, can you please repeat and clarify what the SSOA must sign off on?
Absolutely, and I'll take that, and then if anyone wants to add to that, please do. But basically, a state safety oversight agency must include in their program standard what activities they are going to implement in their oversight of capital projects. So we talked about in, I think, all our presentations that there are many different terms used, but basically the activities that are provided in the SSOA's program standard, what they are going to do to ensure that they are effectively overseeing the capital projects. Those are the activities that they will do, and whatever is stated in that program standard is how they will approve a capital project before revenue service.
Okay, and there are no further questions at this time.
I guess if there are no questions, I could jump on to that last one a little bit, because that's one of the reasons I thought it was really nice the way this particular panel was put together, you know, with the FTA perspective, and then a large complex agency like California, and then a smaller, less complex agency like Wisconsin. There's a lot of room between those two approaches. But what Ruth said makes a lot of sense. It's what you put in your program standard. What are the steps that you outline as your SSO agency to oversee the size and complexity of the RTAs that you oversee? I don't have, personally in our neck of the woods, we don't have we don't have a diversity of projects going on. We don't have a lot of different extensions and things going on. So our process is relatively streamlined compared to that, and our requirements reflect that.
And I'll just add on to that. In California, I have a whole bunch of things that I have to have. My general order requires certain things. And so when FTA comes to evaluate our program, I assume that they'll be looking for everything that we say we're going to have. Like our safety certification oversight plan, our checklist to review their safety certification, all those items that are in our general orders and in our program standard. My expectation is that they'll ask for them and want to see some of them. So make sure we're following our processes.
Okay, and it looks like we have a couple more questions coming in. The next question is, do you recommend SSOAs be involved in all SC meetings from the beginning to avoid significant concerns being raised at the end of construction?
Yes.
Yeah, I would certainly recommend, there's a cases when you're not going to be able to make a meeting probably. But somebody ought to be taking meeting minutes, and you better get a copy. Just if there's anything that was discussed during the meeting that does raise a red flag for you. So yeah, absolutely. It really is disruptive to bring things up at the very end of a project. We certainly wouldn't wait till they submitted an SCVR to identify an issue of concern that we have.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're getting some more in. Next question is, are there some generic safety certification checklists for various projects, i.e. track replacement, vault replacement, cable replacement, etc.?
Our checklist in California is somewhat generic, and we have found that for certain projects there were probably omissions, like for new vehicle procurement. There are certain things we would want to look at that are a little bit different than on a regular capital project. We have certain things that we're going to be looking for, specifically the integration testing with the other vehicles the RTA may have, and those sorts of things that, you know, are part of the process that need to find their way onto our checklist. And so that's one of the revisions we're looking at, you know, under SMS and the new PTASP and the new 672, 3 and 4 requirements on what changes we should make maybe.
Okay, thank you. Next question is for Daren. It says, I may have missed this, but do you rely on a consultant for safety certification support?
No, we have a pretty big program, and it you know, it involves a group of engineers and analysts, as well as field inspectors that we hire with you know, railroad experience. We have track inspectors and signal and train control inspectors, like the FRA state participation program. We have our own inspectors. So we typically do not use contractors. We sometimes lean on the FTA's contractors, like the PMOC and stuff like that. You know, so let me be honest, and in a lot of cases, the RTA would like to keep us apart, but you know, that just makes us want to get together and compare notes. So you know, it's we don't use contractors, and we have a pretty qualified staff with a lot of rail and rail transit experience.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Within an RTA, whose responsibility is it to assess the risk and develop an SMS appropriate for the RTA?
Well, the short answer to that would be the agency safety plan should pretty clearly identify that. I think largely that's going to probably fall on you know, there's going to be a delegation of authority. You have your accountable executive, who's ultimately responsible for safety sort of performance of the plan, your chief safety officer, and then you're going to have some type of review committee, whatever the structure it is. It can be, you know, it's really, I would say, pretty RTA specific and dependent, you know, in my experience. But, you know, just to answer generically, you know, the ASP should pretty clearly spell out who's responsible for those pieces.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Maisha, for assisting us with getting these questions identified and the team here answered. We have hit our limit for our Q&A for this session. And just to be aware, any questions that you have posed, we will address, whether it's at the next quarterly SSOA meeting or another avenue. Now I'd like to, I guess, kick it back to Dr. Ramsey.
All right, thank you, Ruth. And everyone in the audience, let's give them another thank you and round of applause to Ruth, Daren, Eric, and Maisha for reading off the questions. So we already know what time it is. We're about to take a break, but we have to do the polls first. So if we can get the first poll pulled up, please. All right, so looks like 2. Did this session improve your understanding of the topic? Yes, a lot, a little, or no? All right, let's get the second one pulled up. Did the session meet your expectations? It met my expectations, met some of my expectations, or it did not meet my expectations? And remember, this is anonymous. So this is giving us a picture of how we've done. So we won't know who sent the response. All right, next. Do you feel the objectives of the session were met? Yes, no, some were, and or unsure, I mean. So yes, no, some were met or unsure. All right, and for the final question. How are you feeling overall? We still excited? I hope so. Feeling informed, neutral, or overwhelmed? All right, and as you close out that last question, we're going to take a break until 1 p.m. And when we come back, we're going to discuss emergency preparedness and response plans. So thank you, everyone. Take a stretch break, take a coffee break, and we'll see you back here in about 9 minutes. Thank you.